Just as a little background, MPC is a 82-year-old organization that's been around since the 30s and works on a variety of issues related to urban planning. So we work on economic growth in general, but also more specific things like transportation policy, development policy, affordable housing, community development, placemaking, and water resources. And we have staff who try to get their hands on subjects related to that and try to influence policy making at the city, regional, and state level. I think that our organization as a nonprofit is most useful when it can be proactive in pushing our governments to change what they're doing. And that's something that we find really hard to do with our transit-oriented development work. So during this presentation, I'm going to go through and provide you first a sort of graphical illustration of the way the Chicago region has grown over time. To give you a little background about why I think transit-oriented development is so important for our region. And I'm going to go into some of the tools and tactics, as we like to call them, that we've undertaken and pushed for in the Chicago region, including the Grow Chicago tool and website that you mentioned before, but also the community engagement processes that we've undertaken. If I say something that you don't understand or is confusing, or you see something on the screen that doesn't make sense, please feel free to interrupt. But I hope we'll have some time at the end for more substantial conversations. So I just want to start out with a little series of maps about the way the Chicago region has grown since 1950. And the reason why I think looking at these maps is so important from a planning perspective is that the maps really reveal a lot about the way people live in our region, and in turn about the way they interact with the transportation system. And this is something that is not just true about the Chicago region, it's true about every region in our country and the world. Land use is directly related to transportation, and transportation is directly related to land use. And that's ultimately what transit-oriented development is all about. It's suggesting that we have to think about land use when we're planning transit and vice versa. So looking at 1950, what this map shows is the Chicago region, the Illinois side of the Chicago region, I should say, with the city of Chicago in the center, and the population density of people's neighborhoods throughout the region. So what you see here is that in 1950, the vast majority, or the majority of people living in the Chicago region lived in the city of Chicago. And indeed, in 1950, the city of Chicago was the biggest it has ever been, at about 3.6 million people. At that time, most of the city of Chicago had a residential density, which is basically the number of people living in a certain area, of more than 10,000 people per square mile. So that's sort of an urban density. And then you see we had these commuter rail lines, which we still have, and an L system that went out into the suburbs. And what you may be able to notice, but it might be a little hard to see from way back there, is that there were suburban levels of density extending out on the L lines. And that's what you can see in this sort of beige color. So that's between 2,000 and 10,000 people per square mile. Now, over the past 70 years, we've radically changed our transportation system, and the result has been, in many ways, that we've changed the way we live. So, in 1960, you can already see that we started investing in some fixed guideway highways. And so, highways that are separated from the rest of the road network, like our freeways, the Eisenhower right here. The first ones that were built were the Tri-State Tollway, the Jane Addams coming out, and they sort of supplemented the the commuter rail and rapid transit system that we had in our city. But you'll see in 1960 that most of the growth still adhered to those commuter rail lines. So the city started to expand, it was growing, but the growth, for the most part, continued to be along the commuter rail lines. But over the past 50 years or so, that has changed dramatically. So if you look at the way the region's grown, by 2013, this is what our region looks like. So it's actually a very different way for people to live. So for one, we have a much larger freeway system, which was made possible through significant infusions of funding, mostly from the federal government. And the result is that people are much more reliant on the car. And the reason we can see that in these charts, or in these maps, is that the growth patterns of the suburbs no longer adhere to those commuter rail lines. People are not using the commuter rail as a primary mode of transportation to their jobs or to really anything in their lives. And so basically, all this space in between between the commuter rail lines has been filled in by suburban growth, which is what we know, right? The Chicago region is a very large region, the third largest region in the United States, and the vast majority of the region is in a sort of suburban level of density outside of the city of Chicago. You'll also see something interesting about this, which is that between 1950 and 2013, our region pretty much doubled in population from about, let's see, I have the number here somewhere, from about 4.8 million to 9 million. So actually a little less than doubling over that period in the built-up area around the city of Chicago. But the size, the physical imprint of the population on the land expanded far larger than that. It more than tripled in size. And so basically what that means is that the average person is living in a car-oriented environment, right? So fundamentally, they are living in places where they don't have good transit options. They're not very close to the commuter system, and frankly, most of these people are not even close to a bus network. At the same time, you'll see something interesting about the core of the region, the city of Chicago itself. So while downtown we've seen a lot of growth of new towers and things like that, outside of downtown you've seen a ring of vacancy, and that's obvious anytime you take the Green Line or take a road or anything outside of the central business district to the south and the west. We have very high levels of vacancy. And you can see that in these density maps. So if you compare 1950 with 2013, you can see there are all these pockets of white that did not exist at that time.
Question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you recap the population figures? It was 4 million?
4.8 in 1950, and it's about 9 million in a sort of broader region. And that's past what is managed by what's referred to as the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, which is with 6 counties. But those figures are largely comparable. But to get back to that, think about that. In 1950, there were 4.8 million people in the region. 3.6 million of that 4.8 lived in the city of Chicago. Today, we have about 9 million and only about 2.7 million in the city of Chicago. So the city of Chicago lost 900,000 people over that period. I believe that's more than any other city in the United States has ever lost. So we've had a significant change in the way people are experiencing this space. So I think it's worth recapping why these changes occurred to give us some perspective on what we're experiencing now and what we can do about these changes, whether there's anything we can do about the changes. So the first thing that's worth pointing out is that a lot of this obviously has to do with personal preferences. When offered the opportunity to live more cheaply in bigger housing, people chose it, right? So if you're given the opportunity to live in a big house and you can afford it, people will choose to live in the suburbs because that obviously has a lot of pluses that is not possible if you're living in the city. People also sincerely appreciate the access to the private automobile, and that is something that is a trend that has continued up to this day. And if you look at the latest, there's been a lot of talk about how over the last 10 years things have stabilized and people aren't driving as much. If you look at the most recent statistics, you'll see that that's not true. The amount of miles people are driving overall in the United States continues to increase and quite dramatically. So we have pushed in this direction in many ways because people have enjoyed living in the suburban environment. But there are policy issues that encourage this movement to a degree that was much more dramatic than it was in not only other parts of the country, but especially in other parts of the world, where these policy levers were not implemented. And so some of them that are worth pointing to: significant disinvestment by public entities in new construction in urban centers, and rising urban poverty associated with the second great migration of African Americans from the South, and basically the decision whether or not it was caused by policy or real estate brokers or other individuals for basically white middle class to leave the center city. And so that resulted in loss of population, but also loss of sort of the positive benefits of living in the center city. We also had, as I said before, significant federal subsidies for the construction of those highways, associated with significant federal subsidies for home ownership. And so when the federal government is making it cheaper to buy rather than rent, people are going to start buying more than they are, and that encourages more living in the suburbs. And finally, there were these very significant public interventions into our center cities in the urban renewal and urban freeway programs. And I think there are two statistics that I think are really worth pointing out about just how terrible these policies were from the perspective of maintaining the quality of life and maintaining the population of our center cities. So one of them is that some estimate that between 1948 and 1956, okay, so this is an 8-year period, 86,000 people were displaced in the city of Chicago alone from the urban renewal program. So that was basically demolishing people's neighborhoods and forcing them to move elsewhere. At the same time, there are some interesting studies showing that the construction of urban highways, building of the Dan Ryan, the Eisenhower, etc., not only required displacing people from that land, people used to live where the highways were and where UIC was, etc., but also it significantly reduced the value and quality of life in the neighborhoods around those highways, which basically meant that these urban neighborhoods, which used to have a higher quality of life, had that significantly decline. So this is the context that we find ourselves in today. And the impacts continue up to this day, but they're starting to change in terms of how we relate to them. Because many of those things that caused outward migration have ceased to be as important in people's interaction with the city. So one of the things that's worth pointing out is that whereas we had 60 or 50 years of significant declines in basically incomes of people living in urban neighborhoods, in many of Chicago's urban neighborhoods today, and actually in many urban neighborhoods around the country, we see significant increases in rents and incomes of people living in those neighborhoods. So this is, I took 5 neighborhoods on the north and northwest side of the city. So the sort of the neighborhoods that have been in demand of recent years. And you'll see that between 2000 and 2010, adjusted for inflation, the median rent and the median household incomes of these neighborhoods increased quite dramatically, which basically is saying that wealthier people are paying to want to live in these neighborhoods, right? So there's demand to live there. Something about all those policy interventions of the mid-20th century has come back, and now those places have become popular again, right? Because people are attracted to them. But, and this is a really important but, and it's sort of the premise of our whole TOD work, those same neighborhoods which have seen the skyrocketing demand of rent and income all lost population during that period. Now, how is that possible? How is it possible that these neighborhoods that everyone is willing to pay a lot of money to live in, frankly, how could they have also lost population over that time? Well, there are 2 main explanations, I think, worth pointing to. One is changing demographics, and the other is lack of change in supply. So, in terms of demographics, all these wealthy people coming into these neighborhoods, basically, for one, have demand for bigger spaces. They want to live in bigger units. Okay, so they may be taking what used to be a 3-unit building and turning into 1-unit building. But they also have smaller household size. So you have fewer people living in each unit as compared to what existed when those neighborhoods had a lower income population. The other thing is that while we've had slight increases in the number of housing units from new construction in these neighborhoods, the number of new units built has not nearly caught up to the demand to live in these neighborhoods. And this is sort of there's growing evidence basically that when you have significant demand to live in neighborhoods of higher income people, one of the only ways to maintain the population that's currently there and make sure that the population grows is to allow for significant increases in housing units. And that's what our Transit-Oriented Development Initiative is really pushing on. It's basically saying, if we're going to have new construction in the city of Chicago and in the Chicago region, we have to encourage as much as possible more units. And the best place to put those new units is near our transit system, because you're ultimately stuck up against a barrier, right? Which is, if your city grows, that's good for your tax base, but it may not be good for pollution and congestion. Because if the city grew by everybody living in places where they relied on a car, then you would have basically a lot of congestion on our highways, which we already have, so we don't want to add to that. However, if we are to encourage more of our development around our transit system, we can create a city that is more transit dependent, less congested, and less polluted in a lot of ways. And we already know, fundamentally, that transit works as a way of encouraging people to change the way they live in the city of Chicago, okay? So these statistics right here are really interesting to me because they come from actual census data about people living in the city of Chicago. So the graph on the left shows basically how do people get to work on average in neighborhoods very close to a transit system, sort of close to a rail transit station, sort of close to a rail transit station, or further away, so outside a half mile from a transit station. And what you can see here is that people react really strongly to living near the transit system, right? So if you live really close to an L line, you're really much more likely to take the L, or even buses, or even walk or bike to work than you are if you live further away from the transit system. And this has some compelling, I think this is some compelling evidence for why it is just so important if we want to minimize congestion to focus the growth in those areas near the transit station and to maximize the utility of the land around the transit station. Because frankly, if you build the same 100 units of housing in a place either very close to a transit system or far from a transit system, you'd have something like 30 more people choosing to drive to work if the building were built far from the transit system. That's 30 more people who are congesting the highways and polluting the atmosphere. So that's a negative for our city. There's some other things that we know about the transit system in the city of Chicago. One is that the value of living there has gone up, which is very similar to the demand issue. People want to live in those places because they like the access. And finally, and I think this is actually one of the most important and under-discussed values of transit-oriented development, the more growth there is around the transit system, the more likely it is to benefit low-income people. And this is true even if a lot of the growth is in luxury housing. Why is this? Because when you build new projects of any sorts, they're often associated with jobs, which may be in the service sector, which may be in other types of sectors, that are located right around the transit system as well. If we build that new construction near the transit system, we are basically allowing low-income people who don't have access to a car to also have access to those new amenities near transit. So I think that's a really important point worth making. And there's some interesting studies actually, if any of you are interested in emailing me after, I'd be happy to send them to you, showing that low-income people who live near transit basically have reduced time finding jobs when they're unemployed and increased accessibility to jobs. And I think that's really compelling argument for why we need to make this a major premise of our transit-oriented development work.
I hope this isn't an irrelevant question, but a lot of times people who live near transit, especially trains, complain about the noise. I assume that's not a major factor here, or is it?
I think it's actually really interesting you bring that up because property values are 40% higher near transit. It's actually interesting because I live, for example, 2 blocks from a station and I hear the train. So if you live really close to the train, you've got to hear the train as well. I think what's happening here is that fundamentally people are valuing access to mobility over the negatives associated with the sound. That said, there's some important projects that the CTA is doing to reduce the sound associated with the train system. So just for example, the red and purple line modernization project is going to replace the guideway with a concrete bed that will significantly reduce the sound that you hear. And I think that's actually a good point that is undervalued also. I mean, if you ever go under the elevated at Belmont or Fullerton, which are new stations, the trains actually, you can't, when you're underneath, you can hardly hear the train. And even when you're on the street, you can't really hear it. But if you go down the street to Armitage or Diversey, it's really loud because they're on these really old structures. So that's
working on muffling sound. One other thing, does it also encourage a one-stop shop community where you have the balance of the supermarkets and the drugstores where people can just walk everywhere and not have to say, gee, I got to go 10 miles to the shopping center and 5 miles to this. Does it encourage that?
Exactly, and I think you can actually see that in these green figures here. So the green figure shows the percentage of people who walk or bike to work.
Right.
And I think what you're seeing there is that people who live near transit, because of the fact that those communities often have many things, residential, commercial, retail, people are walking and biking around their neighborhoods in a way they would not if they lived in a car-oriented place, right? So if you look at people's overall transportation choices, people who live near transit, even if they have access to a car, often will walk to buy some food, go to the coffee shop, etc. Whereas if they lived in a car-dominated place, they would drive to that. So it's more than just work.
Thank you, Yonah, appreciate that.
So what do we do about this? The TOD initiative that we've been undertaking at Metropolitan Planning Council for about 2 years now has been about finding ways to encourage more transit-oriented development. And again, transit-oriented development is all good, but those statistics I showed from those neighborhoods that are in demand suggest that we're not actually having enough of it to counteract population decline. So that's really the premise behind why we're pushing transit-oriented development as a sort of policy initiative. So we have 3 basic things that we've been working on in the past 2 years. One of them is regulatory change about what is allowed where, how much you can build where. The other is about financial incentives to encourage transit-oriented development, particularly for types of transit-oriented development that is beneficial to lower middle class people. And then finally, community engagement. How do we get people to support transit-oriented development? Why do people oppose it today, and what can we do to make them change their minds? Because I think it's really valuable. I'll tell you about each of these items. So, the first thing I want to point out is that one of the reasons why the housing construction has not increased substantially in the areas where there's demand to live there is that zoning laws prevent you from building new things in most places of the city. So, this is something that I think is particularly interesting in the Chicago context because we have an aldermanic system where each of the 50 aldermen have very strong control over zoning in their wards. But one thing that we know is that in most areas of the city, in areas near transit, zoning laws basically limit density, which means the size of the building basically, and require high levels of parking associated with new development. So one thing that we did last year successfully was push really strongly for the city to change part of its zoning law to reflect the importance of transit-oriented development. And that zoning law was passed in September, and we refer to it as the TOD ordinance. And basically what the TOD ordinance does is it says that in certain zoning districts around our transit stations, you don't have to build as much parking. In fact, in many cases, you can build 0 parking spaces for new buildings. And it basically allows for increased building size in those areas. Now I should say that this zoning change is not enormous. It does not allow you to build 20-story skyscrapers around our transit stations, and it doesn't affect all zoning types around our transit stations. So it has its limitations. However, we did some modeling of what the impact of this change might be over the next 20 years. And we think that what it will do is increase the number of housing units near transit stations in the city of Chicago by 60 to 70,000 over that period, which is about, I believe, 10% of the region's expected housing growth over that period. We think that it will result in about 1,300 on-site affordable units and 150 million for off-site affordable units. And the reason this is true is that the zoning law that we pushed for includes a component that basically requires developers to include more affordable housing if they build a bigger building. Okay, so it has that benefit. It will significantly increase tax revenues in the areas around our transit system because if you had a vacant lot or a 1-story building and replace it with a 5-story building, the Cook County Assessor's Office can basically tax you a lot more money for that building. And that is really good from the perspective of a city that has major structural problems from the issue of collecting taxes.
Is that per year?
That is per year. And we also, by the end of the 20 years. And then 450 million in additional retail sales at neighborhood outlets. And the reason why the last characteristic we think is really important is that one of the things that you often hear when you talk to people in places like Logan Square is that 20 or 30 years ago, along Milwaukee Avenue or other places in the neighborhood, they actually had more retail than they have today. They had more grocery stores, they had more access to basic necessities of life. which seems very confusing given the fact that that neighborhood is booming in a lot of ways, right? So why would it be that Logan Square, a booming neighborhood, has fewer retail outlets than it used to have 30 years ago? One of the biggest reasons, I think, is that those areas have lost significant population over that same period. So, by adding people, we're adding people who are willing to pay money to spend at local retail and local restaurants, which will in turn lead to more access to neighborhood level amenities, which is similar to what you said. Basically, if you build housing, people are eventually going to want to develop restaurants and retail shops around them.
Are developers asking to do in lieu fees for the affordable housing? And if so, how's MPC or your policies trying to keep affordable housing around these two areas?
That's a great question. So, affordable housing is one of the biggest issues we face in the city of Chicago today. Back in 2006 or 7 or something of that sort, the city of Chicago passed something called the Affordable Requirements Ordinance, which says that developers who get a change in zoning or money from the city have to contribute a certain percentage of their units as affordable, or they have to give the city in lieu money, okay? Now, that was changed in 2015, or early 2015, I believe, under a new Affordable Requirements Ordinance, which basically said that you have to provide at least some of the units on site if it's a rental building. So that's really good. So we already made a step there. Now with the TOD ordinance, and this is something that was really exciting to me personally, basically you can build a bigger building above what is allowed under sort of the baseline if you build all the units on site. So the way to think about this is today the TOD ordinance impacts buildings that have a floor area ratio of 3. What it does is allow you, which basically means for everybody's sake, you don't spend all your time looking at zoning maps, that you can build something like 3 to 4 stories on a parcel. But that basically means you can build 3 floors for every space of land you are building on, okay? You're allowed to build up to 3.5 floor area ratios on your building under the ordinance, but if you want to go up to 4, you have to build all your affordable units on site. And so I think that's really positive because it's basically saying as a reward for building more, for allowing you to build more units, developer, we're going to require you to make this a more mixed income building. And so I think that's really positive. The other thing that some aldermen have been pushing, and the 2 aldermen who have really been strong on this are Moreno and Burnett, who represent, Moreno represents kind of Milwaukee Avenue and Burnett represents both the Cabrini Green area and the West Loop. They have pushed very strongly for developers to have to include the units on site if he allows them to get the zoning change. And in some cases, they have requested up to 20% on site, which is above the 10% that the law requires. So I think it really, getting affordable on site is always going to be difficult, in part because the developer community feels very strongly in many cases that they don't want affordable units in their building because they have a fear of low-income people, they believe it reduces the value of their other apartments. But I think if we get successful projects that show that these projects don't fall apart, people are willing to live there even with low-income people around them, then I think that will set a good precedent for the future. So I'm hopeful that that plays out well. It will be interesting to see, keep in mind that this zoning ordinance that we passed was in September, so it was really recent. I will be interested to see over the next 2 years how many developers choose to go up to that floor area ratio of 4 in exchange for the affordable housing on site. It's kind of an experiment because we don't really know how developers are going to react yet. So what we do know though is that, and I should have said this before, there was already a TOD ordinance in place from 2013 that did some of the similar things that we pushed in 2015, but it was far less significant. And 2 of those buildings are right here in terms of ones that are already actually going up. So the one on the left is at Clark and Belmont near the red line, and the one on the right is at Lincoln and Paulina at the brown line. And these buildings are mixed-use buildings with residential on top and then retail at the bottom. But one thing that I think is really interesting about these buildings is that under the law, they could not have been built before the TOD ordinance was in place. And the reason for that is because of the parking requirements under the previous regulations. So a building like the one on the right, I believe has about 30 units, something of that sort. Under the sort of standard law of what's required in terms of parking, they would have had to provide 30 parking spaces. But this building is actually on a really small site. It's right next to the train, like the train line is literally that, right there. If they had tried to fit 30 units into this building, they would have had to build a deck at the bottom of the building. So there would have been 2 floors of parking. But by that point, they would have run into a height limitation, which basically would have left only about 2 stories left of residential, which would have meant fewer units, at which point the whole building would have to go down to 3 floors, so it's 5 floors right now, because they'd only have 1 floor of parking. And then you have really significantly reduced size building, maybe only about 10 units in this building. That's the way the law was designed, and that's one of the reasons why we were having such trouble to build mid-rise, middle-sized buildings in our neighborhoods. Because the parking requirements were too significant. But under the law, that building was able to reduce its parking to, I believe, only nine spaces, something of that sort. All of which can fit on the ground floor, and also allow for retail space on the ground floor. And then build those 4 stories of residential above. All of which is really positive for the neighborhood, because this area right here is already a pretty active neighborhood, but could use more people to get on the train and also to go to the local areas. That said, and this is really important, there remain very significant challenges entirely based on zoning in the city of Chicago. So, even though the TOD ordinance affects many of the areas around our transit stations, most of the land around our transit stations is actually unaffected by the TOD ordinance, because it doesn't affect areas that are zoned for residential only, what's referred to as R zone. And those R zones continue to require very significant parking ratios. So I'm just going to give you an example of my own building, the building I live in. So my building was built in the 30s or something of that sort, maybe the 20s. It is a block and a half from the train station. It is a not very big building, okay? It's like 3.5 stories. It's a small lot, but the building is 20,000 square feet. It has 14 units in this building, and it has 0 parking spaces. Nobody in the building has a parking space. Under the current law, you wouldn't be able to build this building at all. It fundamentally is not allowed, okay? So if my building, let's hope it doesn't happen, burns down in some awful fire, and the developer wanted to rebuild it, the developer couldn't rebuild it because the law has all these things, basically saying only 6 residential units allowed on this parcel. The building has to be pushed back from the street and the alley in every direction. And it would have required a parking space for each of those units. So I don't even know where you would stick the parking. You might have to build something underground or something like that. And so the result is that in neighborhoods like mine, when you do see buildings getting demolished and replaced, they're getting replaced by much lower density buildings. So a building of this sort might be replaced with a building with 6 units on it versus the 14 today. And so it might be new and nice, but it will have fewer people and basically continue to encourage the trend of reduced population in our city. So I don't think we have any chance of changing the zoning law on residential buildings anytime soon. But if the TOD ordinance does produce buildings that people are comfortable with, if people see these buildings in their neighborhoods and see them as positive assets, then I'm hopeful that in 5 or 10 years, we can rethink the way we have these really strict rules about residential units. Now, somebody is here from downstate, and I'm sure many of you are either from the suburbs or go to the suburbs often. What's crazy is that Chicago's zoning ordinance, which is already pretty restrictive in terms of what you can build, is actually quite open compared to most places. Chicago allows you to build a lot. Even that 6 units, that's a lot compared to most places. So if you go to many parts in the Chicago region outside of the city of Chicago, you would probably be able to build 2 units on that lot in most suburban areas. So this is a region-wide problem. It's actually a national problem. We have zoning laws that are very restrictive, don't allow you to build very big buildings on these places, even near transit. Now, moving on a little bit, financing is a huge issue. And the reason why it's a particularly big issue is that while TOD is really useful and working in places that I pointed out, on the north and northwest sides of downtown, it's not nearly as functional on the west and south sides of the city, even though there's very good transit access. And that's because fundamentally zoning is useful as a tool if you have demand to build in those places. The other thing is, even though we include some of that affordable housing in new buildings as part of the law, it's not nearly enough. We have a very significant affordable housing crisis in many of our neighborhoods. In many neighborhoods, people are being displaced by new development, well, in some cases by new development, in some other cases by just rising rents. We have to find ways to create more affordable housing than that, okay? It's not enough to just say, we'll put affordable housing in the new buildings in the high market areas. That's not enough to make a TOD strategy applicable to the whole city and the whole region. So we've been working really hard over the past 2 years to get enterprise community partners, which is basically a community development financial institution, and some other CDFIs to work to develop new financing sources designed specifically for transit-oriented development in our city. And basically what this would mean is that these financing sources would be dedicated to making it more feasible for affordable housing to be constructed near transit in places where there isn't the market demand for new luxury or market buildings. One example that I think is worth pointing out is up in Uptown. So Uptown is an interesting community where the market has really changed over the past 5 years. It's become a community where developers want to spend lots of money there. There's this beautiful school that we worked on that I'll show you in a second. But across the street there were some empty parcels, some parking lots. And earlier in 2015, there was a bid, there was a sale of one of those lots, basically for developers to say, are you interested in buying this lot? And keep in mind this is about a block from the Wilson Red Line station. Now, an affordable housing developer came in and offered actually quite a bit of money for that land and was planning to build a new affordable housing development on that site. But they were significantly outbid by a private market developer for that same land. Now, that's not inherently a bad thing, but it is indicative of the situation we find ourselves in, which is that in neighborhoods where there's a lot of interest to build, affordable housing developers can't compete for the land. And so if they want to build new housing on that site to make TOD more accessible to everybody, they're stuck. They can't bid against market developers. And plus, the financing tools they have access to take too long. Private developers can basically use ready streams of equity to pay for properties much more quickly than affordable housing developers are. So ideally, over the next year, we'll be able to develop some cool tools, some new financing tools that basically allow affordable housing developers to play the same game and to also engage in new construction in this area. Now, the last issue I wanted to talk about is community engagement. As I said at the beginning, making sure that people in communities are okay with transit-oriented development is actually one of the hardest issues we deal with. Not so much true in a place like Uptown, where actually the community is largely okay with bigger buildings because they're used to towers, but often in places like Logan Square, where the community is used to a lower scale neighborhood and people don't want to see big buildings. And so the result is that you often have these really contentious community meetings when new developments are proposed, like on Milwaukee Avenue. And everyone is up in arms about how this new tower is going to destroy their community, et cetera, et cetera. So one thing we wanted to do is make basic information about transit-oriented development available to everyone so that at minimum, we could have an honest debate about the pros and cons of development. Because, look, everyone's aware that people have aesthetic priorities, and I don't think that aesthetic priorities can be followed. I mean, if you feel comfortable with the way your community looks and like it, probably move there for that reason. That's not something to dismiss. That's not something we can just be like, oh, well, that's not important. It is very important. However, when you say we're going to stick to our aesthetic, there are negatives associated with that as well. It may mean fewer people living in your neighborhood, less retail, less taxes for our city and our state. So we should at least make that clear to everyone. And so MPC worked with Stephen Vance, who runs this thing called Chicago Cityscape, to develop this tool called Grow Chicago. And I invited all you to go to it, metroplanning.org/GrowChicago. And the tool, I think, is pretty cool because you can click on any parcel in the city of Chicago, or type in an address, and as long as it has a zoning classification that can be altered, and by that I mean it's not what's called a planned development, then you can actually see on that site, over here, this is an example, you can see what the zoning is, you can see how big the lot is, and you can also see how much the current zoning allows you to build on that lot. And what you can do with these scroll bars over here is actually play around and develop a concept for what you want to see on the site given the current zoning. And what's neat about this tool is that based on your inputs, based on what you're envisioning for the site, we'll give you immediate outputs about how that affects the community, okay? So we estimate how many parking spaces people are expected to use, how many tax revenues we expect people to get, we expect the state and city to get, how many new retail sales we expect the community to grow because of the development. And all of that, we hope, can be useful for aldermen and for others, and for developers and for the community to say, okay, this is what a building would be in this community, this is what the outcomes would be. How would that change if you, for example, made the building 2 stories shorter or 2 stories taller? What are the impacts? And this tool is basically able to show you that immediately. We also need to build more public support. And I think this is something that urban planners take really seriously in general. I mean, urban planning is a field that cares about community engagement, but unfortunately the ways that we often engage the community look something like this. So either a sort of like poster display board where everyone goes around and like maybe talks to somebody but like writes something down on a piece of paper and doesn't necessarily feel like they've been heard, or a big community hall meeting where people are screaming about how they're upset about X or Y, and the developer is up front defending his or her himself. And I think the problem with this fundamentally is that it doesn't allow people to talk about the trade-offs. It doesn't allow people to see, to be able to even say, okay, these are the positives, these are the negatives of other projects. We should be honest with each other. So MPC does this thing called the Corridor Development Initiative, which we did in 2014 in Uptown and Logan Square. And I think it's a sort of proactive and more positive model for what we can do with our development futures in the areas around transit. And I think one thing that's especially good about it is that it encourages people to really understand what the benefits of transit-oriented development are, even as they also can talk about the trade-offs, like additional height and things like that. So the way these meetings are structured is that people sit around tables and they literally develop models of what they want to see on a specific site that we have them discuss. And ideally, we work with the aldermen to make sure that when this site is developed at a future point, whatever the people say as part of these meetings, the sort of joint agreement about what the acceptable trade-offs are for new development are integrated into the development process. So in this case, this was the school, Stewart School, just across from the Wilson Station in Uptown. And we worked with Alderman Kappelman to develop a community plan based on people's input. And we had I think something like 600 people involved in some way, either through the meetings or through the online system. And the great news is that that has actually led to the sale of the school. It was unfortunately a school that was closed as part of the school closing program. But led to the sale of the school, and that school's going to be redeveloped, and it's also going to integrate significant density on the surrounding lots. And that, I think, is really positive for the community because it means that people at our meetings did come to an agreement that they were okay with new construction, they were okay with seeing development on these lots, but they wanted to see the school preserved. And that's indeed what's going to happen. So that, I think, is a positive outcome, and that's the kind of thing we need more of to make sure that when we're talking about new development, it's not purely a conflictual thing. It's a positive, proactive, and community-engaged issue. So that's where we are right now. I'm excited about transit-oriented development in Chicago. The mayor just proposed a big expansion of the downtown zone this morning. That's an interesting complement to what we're talking about, something worth looking into. But we still have a very significant amount of work to be done if we're going to encourage Chicago to grow and add people to the neighborhoods where people want to live. So thanks so much, and feel free to ask me any questions.
I have a question that has to do with the trade-off between having more occupable space in the building and getting rid of former parking requirements. I've heard people from the development community say offhand comments about how in relaxing some of those parking restrictions within TOD zones, the city actually might have given something up in terms of, since you can get more rent per square foot out of occupable units rather than providing parking on site, that developers might have even had an appetite to turn that parking requirement, have like a gray zone there where they could pay down to have even less parking space or pay. Do you see any appetite for that moving forward? Maybe if there are changes to the residential zoning ordinance to do TOD development in residential zones, maybe developers would be willing to treat parking requirements like a marketplace, and that could be a tool to provide equity for some of the housing financing you were talking about.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question. So, first of all, if you get the parking reduction under the TOD ordinance, you have to comply by the affordable requirements ordinance. So there is a trade-off. Like, developers do have to pay into that issue. So that's one response. However, I think more broadly, your point about the potential for parking to be more of a market between developers is so much validity to me. And I think it's something that we need to start exploring further. It's like parking trading, allowing people in a certain building to buy parking in another building. For example, a lot of buildings that were built in the South Loop over the past 15 years have significantly more parking than is used in those places. What if we allowed new buildings to be built and for them to buy parking spaces from existing buildings next to them or across the street? That would be a really interesting way of allowing you to change the parking requirement. And it's similar to something called transfer of development rights, which I'm sure you know about, but this is basically a tool that says that developers can buy the development rights, so the right to build, from another building to put on top of their building. And the reason why this is useful is that, for example, if you're a church or you're a historic building that sits on a parcel that allows a big building on it, you might be inclined to sell your land and demolish the building or get rid of whatever community use you're providing because the market is offering a lot of money for your land because you can build something big. However, if you allow something called transfer of development rights, you as the church or the community center or whatever can sell the right to build above your building to another building in the neighborhood, and they can just build a bigger building. And the result is basically you can do two things. You can have as much density as you would otherwise under the zoning, but also you can allow historic buildings and churches and things like that to stay in place. So that's a similar tool I think we need to start implementing.
What's the appetite or applicability of this to some of the suburbs? It seems like some of the most desirable places in the suburbs are within walking distance of the metro station. So does that mean, and development is occurring, so does that mean they've got it down, or is there more to that?
So the great news is that the Regional Transportation Authority, RTA, and Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning have been, for the last 5 years or something, working on TOD plans and TOD-related zoning in the suburbs. The reason why we actually came into the city is you would think like, oh, the city would be the place where everything was happening, but in fact, as of 2 years ago, there was very little pressure on the city of Chicago to change the way the zoning worked. So we actually came in kind of after the suburbs in many ways. However, there remain many, because we have so many suburbs in the Chicago region, like 270 or something, it really depends on what you're talking about in terms of what the zoning allows. So CMAP has worked with like Oak Park and Evanston to allow significant increases in density in those places, but other suburbs may not allow that at all. And I think that's actually something that we need more investigation of, to be frank. I mean, one thing that I would love to see, for example, is a unified zoning code for the region to be able to clearly express and understand what is allowed where. Because that kind of analysis, I as a person can't do, nobody can do generally for the region. I can't tell you whether or not a certain part of the suburbs is not allowing transit-oriented development around their stations.
Why do you think this drastic downzoning in areas such as one where you're living has occurred?
Yeah, so that's I should have pointed that out. Like, how is it possible that my building could not be rebuilt as it is today? The reason is that when it was built, the zoning allowed it to be built, right? It's not against the law. So there, over the period between generally the 50s and 70s, City of Chicago very significantly downzoned huge sections of the city. It actually changed the rules about all the zoning classes, particularly to require more parking than they used to require. And I think that was reacting to two things. One, people's discomfort with a lot of the towers that were being built along the lakefront during that period. I mean, I won't lie to you, the towers along the lakefront in much of the city are really ugly. And it's no surprise that people reacted to that with huge hostility. If you saw your neighborhood having beautiful brick buildings get replaced by quite ugly new towers, I would probably fight that too. That's a big problem. So I think people fought that and said, we don't want that kind of density, we don't want that kind of change in our neighborhoods. In terms of the parking, you know, the parking requirements change with increased rates of car ownership. But these things are self-reinforcing. There are a lot of studies out there that basically demonstrate that when you provide more parking in buildings, people are more likely to have a car. So there's sort of like there's a seesaw action there. If you add parking, people are more likely to drive. If people are driving more, you're more likely to need to add parking. So we need to counteract both of those forces in some way.
One more question. As far as building public support, how much of a factor would be enlightening people on the back to the city and back to the downtown movement, including a modernized pedestrian wall?
So I don't have an opinion about the pedestrian wall. I was never here during that time. I think one thing that we know is that if there's increasing demand to live near transit, that indicates that people want to live near transit. So we need to recognize that if we want our city to grow, to make up that 900,000 people who we lost over that period, we have to provide these types of living environments that people want to live in. And what seems to be true is that there is a significant market for people to live in dense environments where they have strong walkability. And that's a message that absolutely we have to, as a group, talk about. It's something that if we don't talk about, can be just dismissed as like, oh, a sort of side thing. But certainly, the increase in values, I think, is really indicative of the change in people's perception. And there was an interesting article that came out a few days ago suggesting that for the first time, the average value in urban America is higher than the average value in suburban America of housing. And that's actually a fascinating change that is totally contrary to what things were even like in 1990. In 1990, the city of Chicago's values were terrible in many places. So that's something we need to, it's part of the discussion in terms of why this is such an important issue.
Great presentation. I want to ask you about bankers. It may not be your area, but oftentimes behind a developer decision to provide parking is a banker insisting on it for resale purposes or as an asset class. What's your knowledge of how the banking community is responding to property buildings in the city and more importantly similar parking reduced parties in the suburbs?
So that is absolutely a huge problem, particularly for retail spaces. We have this big problem, for example, where when you build new retail in the city of Chicago, even in areas where people are walking a lot, bankers will often insist that the parking faces the main entrance. And this is a trend you have done a lot of work on, and absolutely a major issue. And it continues to be true. And one example that I think is worth pointing to is, or two examples, there are 2 new grocery stores currently being built on the south side of the city of Chicago. Wonderful news, great. These places don't have access to quality foods in many places. Those are in Inglewood, it's a Whole Foods, and in Bronzeville, and that's a Mariano's. If you look at the way those buildings have been designed, they've been designed as if they're in the middle of, some distant suburb. They're basically strip malls, huge single-story buildings with a huge parking lot up front, giant empty walls facing the street. I mean, you can go down to King Drive right now and see exactly what that building in the Mariano's is going to look like. Bankers are absolutely at the one of the reasons why this is a big problem. One of the biggest problems I think we have is that because of the fact that the market remains kind of untested compared to their suburban stores, they've been reluctant to change their mentality. However, I would suggest that if you look at the highest performing Target, the highest performing Whole Foods, the highest performing well, those are the ones I'm talking about now. In the country, per square foot, they're in the densest areas of the country. So I think, if my memory serves me correct, at least in recent years, the highest performing Target in the country is that one right on State Street, per square foot, number of sales. The highest performing Whole Foods is in the basement of Columbus Circle in New York City. No parking either of those buildings. Very urban, very walkable. So I'm hoping that those trends are getting people to wake up in terms of the way we can design retail in a way that is more pedestrian accessible.
So aside from the ARO, which is expanding affordable housing in those hot areas, those high demand areas, how does the tool, which I like a lot, I think is really cool, how does that help expand kind of affordable housing, especially in those not high demand areas, which we have a lot, and we have a ton of transit capacity in low development areas with a lot of vacancy.
I wish I could say it did something, but it doesn't. I mean, because the tool is fundamentally reflecting, the tool is sort of agnostic when it comes to whether you could actually develop in this area. It doesn't say, oh, this building is infeasible because nobody wants to live in this area or whatever. It doesn't say that. It also doesn't say, oh, you want to do affordable in this building? Well, you're going to need some low-income housing tax credits or some other source. It doesn't say that. So the reason why we chose not to include that stuff is that, frankly, most people don't want to get into details about like what affordable financing sources are. However, that's what we're trying to do in the back scene or the behind the scenes with respect to developing new financing sources near transit. I think there's a lot of fear in some communities about displacement, about the negative impacts of transit-oriented development, and I really want to say that that fear is reasonable. People have totally the right to be concerned about the future of the neighborhoods. But that's why we need to develop new ways for people to actually have a response. And I'll tell you what, saying no to new development is not going to work. It's not going to stop increases in rent or the turnover of existing housing stock from low-income to high-income people. We need to develop other tools that make it possible to develop low-income housing or preserve low-income housing. And that's why we're trying to work really hard on this issue. But it's a huge problem, and especially in a city like Chicago, which doesn't have the resources, or at least hasn't decided to allocate the resources on that issue, we are really in a tough spot. So that, sorry that's a nice answer.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I appreciate it.